Okay. We got to give Emily a second to give me the thumbs up. You got a nice smile on your face tonight. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Coffee Chat Christ Talk special. Today, I've got my grandson Justin, who has a degree in theology, and he's going to be talking about something very powerful. I don't know if a lot of people are familiar with Ecclesiastes, but it's a very different book of the Bible, probably more different than anything else in the Bible. It's a tough place to go. What he said to me, by the way, hello, Justin. Um,
Hi.
him and I both write for Two Measures Foolish, which is a apologetic Christian apologetic, and Justin writes for too, and I do too, about deep things. Christian apologetics is about writing about deep things of the Bible, Scripture, and things like that. Now, Justin wrote, "The Christian life alone is worth living." And his first paragraph, I'm going to read that out loud because it was pretty heavy. One of the most enigmatic verses in the entire Bible is also one of the most intuitive. I'm having a hard time. Justin, I'm going to let you take over on this first paragraph, okay?
All right, I'll go ahead and read it. One of the most enigmatic verses in the entire Bible is also one of the most intuitively obvious. Once someone is honest with themselves about the state of this world, the great wickedness that we witness daily, the injustice of war, the corruption of authority, and all other horrors of humanity. Indeed, this verse captures the natural, holy, and true response to the violence, sexual perversion, and delusion that we see, experience, and sometimes even partake in, in our own shame.
Would you read Ecclesiastes 4 2 through 3
Yeah.
for us?
So this is one of my favorite verses, and I think it's because it's so enigmatic. The fact that it's in the Bible, and it's verse 4, or sorry, it's verse 2 and 3 of chapter 4 of the book of Ecclesiastes. And I personally like using the English Standard Version the most. And here it is. It's and I thought the dead who are already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been, and who has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun.
Wow,
So
that's
that's
pretty
something that
powerful.
surprised me when I was a non-believer and I was reading through the Bible, and yeah, I remember getting to reading through. I'm like, oh wow, meaningless, meaningless. That doesn't sound right. And I learned, oh, that's actually just a translation error. That it's actually saying, vapor of vapors, everything's vapor. And I'm like, okay, that makes a lot more sense why Christians would believe that. They think everything's going to come to an end, so of course they believe everything's vapor. And I was reading through it, and then I came across this verse, which it's just it was the way I was raised and the way I thought it was just like I say in the next paragraph, it seems like a truism. It seems so on its face obvious, but it seems so non-Christian of a belief to find it in the Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible when they believe in a good, true, God who created everything. It was very perplexing to find this verse, and I remember coming to a pause and being like, "Wait a second, how is it that they believe in this? This is the thing that I have been criticizing, the whole idea of theism in my mind and in my heart. And this is the thing that I keep talking to myself whenever I'd get upset. I'm like, well, it'd been better and I've been born, and I don't want to die and make everyone sad. I don't want to, but at least I wouldn't have been ever born. And as you know, Grandpa, that is the reason that I love the movie It's a Wonderful Life. Is that movie at the very end of the movie? He has that moment where he's looking over the bridge and he says, "I wish I," or when he's about to kill himself. It's like an 80-year movie. If you haven't seen it, I'm not going to worry about spoiling it for anyone on here. But he's about to kill himself, and then Clarence, the angel, comes and saves him, and he shows him a world, similar to God's middle knowledge of what it's like if he had never been born.
Right.
And so that's why that movie is my favorite movie ever. And it's also why this verse, that movie took sort of the emotional, like, this is what that looks like. And then Ecclesiastes saying, yes, you are right. It would have been better if you're not been born. And so, there's two different pictures that we're seeing with this. And I wanted to understand, I'm like, well, I could see how it could be kind of like It's a Wonderful Life, how it could be that, it's better that you were born for maybe everyone else, but I still had to go and witness all this evil and experience and all this, and there was a lot of questions that I had. And, I remember I came to like a full stop when I came to this verse, and it's very early in the book. It's only, Ecclesiastes chapter 4, there's still 2/3 or 2/4 of the whole book still waiting for 2/3 of the book left to read. I guess since it's at the beginning of 4, it's anyways. But yeah,
I would suggest if you pull out the Bible and you start get a quiet place and start reading Ecclesiastes. Be prepared to put a seatbelt on.
Yeah, especially if you're critical of the Bible, and if you're critical of the seeming rose-colored glasses that is very easily, the criticism is very easily leveraged upon Christians. I hear it multiple times, that it's like, oh, kumbaya, you just, love everything, love's the answer. It's like Christianity is being associated with the, the sexual revolution of the 70s kind of thing. That's,
right.
Live and let live mentality, as if although that's at all what Christianity teaches. And, that's
Justin, would you read the fourth? Would you read the fourth paragraph for us?
Yeah. So, I see this criticism even leveraged in academia, and I actually believe it to be the strongest criticism against Christianity, and that whole idea that God shouldn't have created it at all. If God can't make the world perfect, morally perfect, that there's no evil, then at the end of the day, you can make different, arguments about, well, maybe there's, the free will defense and all that. And I think Alvin Plantinga did a good job of, with his free will defense. But I think where he falls short is when he says that God had good reasons to include, to create, just because freedom is such a good that it's worth allowing evil to create. I think that starts getting on the theodicy side. I think there's a better argument. That's a little bit out of the scope of this specific essay and conversation, which would be great to have sometime. But that is the strongest criticism I see in academia. And one thing I found really, that really jumped out at me when I read this verse, because that was my criticism too, was that the Bible basically cedes that. It's like, yeah, it would have been better if nobody, someone wouldn't have been born and wouldn't have experienced evil. Yep. And then next question, and I was like, wait a second, this is what the atheists argue and say, and then leverage against Christianity, and then Christianity tries to argue it like in their own book that it says that that's the case. I don't understand, and that was what really locked me into trying to figure this verse out, because as I say later in the article, growing up, I've been exposed to enough, smart thinking Christians, like C.S. Lewis and, St. Thomas Aquinas and other Christians who, they weren't stupid. They spent their time really dissecting these verses and really trying to understand it. And especially now that I'm on the other side, it's like sort of a pet peeve to me when I hear people say that, Ecclesiastes is inspired, but not everything it says is true. And the more I read it and the more I understand the verses and I start putting pieces together, and this is one such enigmatic verse in Ecclesiastes that on its face, a lot of Christians I've seen say, well, this is one thing that's not true. Moving on, nothing to see here, citizen. And it's so lazy. And so um, I had a lot of influence from Chuck Missler even before I came to believe through, Grandma, your wife. And and I remember one thing he said is, if you ever see a contradiction in the Bible, you should rejoice because you're about to learn something. Because there are no contradictions in the Bible. I'm like, okay, well, if the Christian claim is that this thing is infallible, it's got to be true. If it's true, then its claim is also that it's infallibly true. So I'm like, okay, well, if I can find some, this contradiction, and I can follow it on, then I can, I don't even have to read the rest of this book. I don't have to do anything, because I can say, oh, look, contradiction. I can throw the whole baby out with the bathwater, because if any of it's not true, then, just very obviously that's its claim. So if I find something that's not true, I can throw it out. That's actually how Burton Russell is, because he found something that I disagree with his interpretation, but that he found something he found to be a contradiction, and that destroyed his faith. Infallibility of the Bible is a very, very important thing to hold on to as Christians. So I thought this might be my way of, not having to study the rest of the thing. I can move on to the next religion and see if that's true. So I kind of latched on to that for my own intellectual, laziness. But I also knew that I had to be honest. I'm like, okay, well, there are people who think about these things that were much smarter than me and had a lot more time on their hands and have been around a lot longer. I should take it seriously and not just chalk it up, as I say in the article, as, religious doublethink. Let me see if there actually is some sort of, understanding that reconciles it. And if I can't, then, well, that might be a strike. That might be something I could be like, well, there's this thing over here. I'm not sure I'm willing to bite. So that led me down the journey of discovery on this verse. And it didn't come all at once. I ended up having to read other parts of the book before I understood this verse.
Yeah. Do they have any idea who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes?
Yeah, the common consensus, and by common I mean the the very, very predominant view, is that it was King Solomon who wrote this book.
Yeah, he was a pretty smart. He was a pretty smart guy. God gave him some real interesting smarts, although he didn't always use them. But
according actually to First Kings, I think it was chapter 3. I read it's somewhere in the article, but inside of First Kings, it actually, there's the account of Solomon praying to God that he doesn't want, that all he asks is for the wisdom to rule his people wisely, and God tells him that there will never be anyone wiser than you, Solomon. And because you ask for wisdom, you're going to get rich and fame and power and might, all the rest of it as well, just as a bonus, because God was so pleased that he asked for wisdom. And Solomon's, supernatural wisdom led him to the conclusion that many people come to, and that is, God shouldn't have created it all. It'd be better if I was never born. Why am I going through this suffering? What is this really is this what it's worth it? And I think it goes also that this is, I think, the question of our time. This is the question. The suicide rate hit a record high recently, just in the last few
right,
years.
right.
And so people are asking this question. They're looking at the economy. They're seeing how things are going. They're looking at our leaders. They're looking at everything. And they're seeing our culture, and they're not finding answers. And people are asking themselves, what is life really worth it? Is this worth it? And they're saying no in record numbers. And they're saying no to the point where they're willing to take their own lives at the, regardless of the potential consequences.
Right. Isn't it interesting when life has gotten easier physically? More people want to commit suicide. When life was very tough and hard, and there was a lot of things going on that you had to physically overcome, suicides weren't such a big deal.
Yeah,
so there's
and that's why I think this kind of discussion, and specifically this topic, is so important, because we're in a society that desperately needs to know that life is worth it. and why life is worth it, because there's only one answer as to why life is worth it, right?
Right.
And to give a little background, remember I was I wanted to find out if Christianity was true and then move on to the next one. And the background justification that I had was because I wanted to make sure that if I went and committed suicide, then I wouldn't have anything waiting for me on the other side. I was sort of, if you're going to do something drastic, then you want to don't just dive into it impulsively. And so my religious search was actually a form of trying to, maybe ensure myself, not assure, but ensure, make sure that that I wasn't jumping into it and accidentally cursing myself. So it was this does hit really close to home as to, how do I know life is worth living? And this verse really jumped out at me because this was the thing. I'm like, I want to kill myself, but it would have been better if I never been born at all. And the Bible says, oh yeah, that's true. And I'm like, wait, I'm trying to like make sure that I don't have hell waiting for me, and trying to disprove Christianity so I don't have to worry about it. Now this book's completely validating my greatest criticism against it.
Right. And you know what? When I was an atheist, one of the terms that pulled me up by my short hairs, and I ask people this all the time, especially if they say I'm an agnostic or I don't believe in God, because most of us have had this question. The question is this all there is? Is this it?
Mm.
And it's something that it goes hand in hand with the question that you were just bringing up there. But is this it? We go through life and then we die. We live 40, 50, 60, 70 years, and that's it. It's just everything is over and done with. And our soul screams out, no, there has to be more. There has to be something else. Otherwise, what was the point? What was the point of living through this life? And it also begs another question that you can ask God is this the best possible of all worlds? Because so many people think that this life is so hard on this planet. Could God have created something else with free will in the midst of it?
Yeah.
Is this the best possible of all worlds? This is not it either. So, in
Yeah.
your opinion, is this the best of all possible worlds?
Well, if you're asking my opinion is that yes, indeed, this is the best possible world. I don't think you might be able to make a philosophical argument for that, but I personally think that this is the best possible world. And when we say world, we're not talking like Earth versus Mars, of course. We're talking, this best version of Earth that God could have created with this set of spirits and beings on this planet. Maybe there was as the Rick and Morty quote, the universe where Hitler cures cancer, would that have been better? Well, I mean, that's a judgment that I'm not sure I'm qualified to make. I don't think anyone's really qualified to make that. That really is in the realm of omnipotence. And so what we're really doing in that is we're sort of getting into what I call the divine filtration process of
Okay.
worlds. And this is a lot of what Alvin Plantinga talks about in his free will defense. He makes the claim that, there are many possible worlds that exist. There are worlds wherein, I do A, or, good, I do B, evil. There are, both of those are possible because of free will, there's only one world that is actual in the sense that I will have chosen A, right? If I was presented with a circumstance, getting into Molina's middle knowledge for Molinism, this is the possible world. Me as a free will agent, what would I do in this? Well, I would choose either A or B. God would know in his omnipotence that I would choose A. Well, that means that while B is, world B is, logically possible that I would do it, as a free will agent, I'm going to do A because that's what I would do in such a circumstance. Which means that while B is logically possible, if God wants to maintain the free will that he himself is, granting without contradicting himself and imposing his will and thus breaking free will, that means that world B is technically impossible for God to create. People think that
Hmm.
God's ability just do whatever he wants, but he can't logically make world B come into existence, making because free will implies that I am an agent, that I'm an unmoved mover in my own will, and because of that, that means that unless God wants to break my free will, then become a tyrant, then he's going to have to allow me to choose A, which means he can't. I mean, world B can never exist. And so what's scary about that, and this is where Alvin Planting it got really interesting with the way he was thinking about this, is that you can say that about, what if in every possible world, okay, well, maybe you wouldn't have chosen that circumstance, but let's say, God made it so that way that circumstance where you chose evil or B would have never actually happened. Maybe he cleverly skirts the situation by, never even bringing the quote, temptation or whatever for you to sin. Well, who's to say that you wouldn't also sin in that world, right? Well, let's say you sin in 50% of them, and not 50% of them, right? Well, that's at least logically possible. But there's also the problem of what if it is that an individual, a free will agent, no matter what circumstance they were in, what possible universe or world that they're in, they would have at least chosen B, evil at least one time. Well, that's at least logically possible, is what Alvin Plantinga says. And he calls that idea transworld depravity, meaning at least in every possible world,
Hmm.
this soul, this being, this person is afflicted with, an ailment he calls transworld depravity. They are going to be depraved in every single possible world. Is that at least logically possible? Well, yes, that's at least logically possible. And then he takes it another step further. Well, is it logically possible that everyone has transworld depravity? And if everyone has transworld depravity, if that's at least logically possible, he takes that to start refuting as to why he uses it to start refuting why evil would be created, because he says, well, if it's free will's a thing, then and if it's at least logically possible that free will would potentially at least logically create this situation of transworld depravity for every being that would ever exist, then now we're getting to the problem of, well, should God have created it all, if it's even possible? And let's say it is, because that's the claim of the Bible, is that we're all depraved, you know,
Yeah.
and
And
and then that gets us
another
in
thing. Go
real
ahead. I'm sorry.
that gets us ultimately back to this discussion in this verse is God said, if transworld depravity is true and it is better to have never been born, well, it's like, well, then so then that's where the atheist takes it. It's like, okay, well, then let's say transworld depravity is true, let's grant everything, let's say it's logically possible, so then why should God have created it all? And that's what this verse is saying. Is like, well, it would have been better to not be born at all, to see the evil under the sun, if even if transworld depravity were real. And so
Right.
yeah, and that's a really big criticism. I that's one thing that I personally find to be the weakness of Alvin Planting is free will defense, is that he takes that to be, well, then without free will you can't have love, and because love is worth it, uh, it is better to have love in the existence of love than than to not have any creation whatsoever. I think there's a better defense to it. I plan on writing my PhD on it, and the amount of thinking and talking that going into that would definitely far exceed our time here. So yeah, I guess people will just have to stay tuned for that.
Well,
But
I know a lot of people have said, why did, because this planet is a very hard place for a lot of people and has been throughout uh, eternity and creation.
mhm,
And some people ask, why? Uh, One of the things is, why do bad things happen to good people? But so many things. But one of the things that I have come to realize is if bad things didn't happen to people, if they did not occur in their lives, then they would have no reason to reach out for God because they would become God in their own right. It's like rich people. Why it's so hard for God to get breakthrough to rich people because they can pay for everything that will take care of themselves to a
mhm.
certain degree, to a certain point.
That is,
Um,
but that's only true in a world that is already godless and fallen, right? So if Adam and Eve theoretically never ate the apple, then they were already in communion with God. Presumably, it would have continued that status quo. They would have never needed to have some sin that brought them to God because they would have already been with God, right? And we don't know what a world past Adam and Eve without sin would have looked like. It just we have no idea what it looked like, what it would have looked like. It's really in the realm of omnipotence. Um, but
we,
I
we
one
will have that opportunity at some point.
yeah, but
And I know
we'll get
a
a
lot of
different.
Christians, all they have to look at is what's going on in the world today. And my wife has said this. She was in tears because she read some stuff about things going on in the world. And she was like, I just want to go home. I just want to go home. Because for Christians, this place becomes really unbearable because of all the evil that surrounds us. And we don't want to have this in our lives anymore. And we don't want to have to read about it anymore because it just seems like it's everywhere. We just want to have peace in our lives. And what comes along with the peace is the non evil. And the only way all this can occur and the only way God can allow people, believers, into heaven is because they've given up their rebellion. And
Mhm,
that's rebellion is everything. All that you see that's going on in the world is rebellion. Is rebellion against authority, is against this and against that, but it's mostly against God Himself.
mhm,
Um, and I look at that, and part of me is like, I'm a stranger here. I'm a stranger in a strange land, and I don't want to be here any longer than I have to. And I know Paul would talk about that. He was almost desperate to leave, take me away from this.
mhm.
And I think when we realize what has occurred and what is possible out there, yeah, yeah, we this is not our home.
Mhm.
And I think Ecclesiastes really hammers the nail right on the head about where our thought process is. When I was a real believer in evolution, and thought things just popped into being out of nowhere and stuff like that, and I was like, "What's the point?" If evolution was true and it came out of it, what was the point? If there was the Big Bang and the universe was just spreading out, and pretty soon, all the stars and everybody would just wink out and go cold. Uh, that is like, what was the point? What was the
Yeah,
point of the universe? You know?
yeah. No, is it really worth the struggle just to die and then have it all be over? Why not just skip all the suffering and get it done and over with? As we discussed, record people are seeing and acting on. And so, this article, sort of that I have here, also is sort of the first prong of what I what I plan to write my dissertation on. This whole idea of should God have created it all? Ecclesiastes already has seeded, this sort of, impossible feat for God that no, it would have been better for someone not to have been born and experience the suffering than to live and experience it. And the person who died and doesn't have to experience it anymore is better off than the person who's alive and still having to experience it. And so, the way my mind works, I decided to jot down an equation, and I included it in this article as well for
Oh
those
yeah,
who know.
give us that equation. I
Yeah,
read it here and I was like a mathematical equation for life and death and unborn. Tell us about that.
yeah. So first, it starts off, very simple. Let's just go from the basic formulation. Life. It's better to be dead than alive. So just a typical. Life is less than death, and then both of the, and then again less than unbirth, never being born at all. But I realized anyone who died also was alive, which means really the equation ought to be life is less than death plus life, right? Because someone lives and then they die. And then, death plus life, living and then dying, is still, not as good as just having never been born at all, right? Not being born at all, never, that unbirth seems to be, the, the preferable option. That's sort of where most people stop on. It's like live and die, and then what? And then I just suffered for no reason. I'd rather not be born at all. And so I didn't really have much else to go on. So I just kept reading the book. I'm like, okay, well, I'm vindicated. Move on. And so I got to the final verse of the book, chapter 12, verse 14 of Ecclesiastes. And that was, for God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. And I knew from childhood Bible studies that Revelation talks about this, the second death, and and it calls that judgment that second death. People are judged, and then they experience the second death, right? And so I was like, oh, okay, well that changes the math a little bit, but yeah. So now the equation turns into life is less than, dying twice, so 2 times death, dying squared, plus life. So you have life plus death squared is going to be better, is still going to be better than life, right? Than being alive and still having to experience all that suffering. And the reason for that is because justice, people have to be, justice has to be served, and that's going to be better than the unjust lack of judgment upon people, right? Murderers ought to be punished, thieves ought to be punished, and so that second death is going to be better. Still, would have been better, but you know what? It would be better than not being punished and not having justice enacted out on everyone, including you, not being born, not going and doing it. And so on birth was still preferable and better. And Solomon knew that because that's how the book ends. And so it really actually became even more impossible of an equation. Now we have not only is, not being born at all, the better option than, living and dying, but it's also better than, living, dying, and having justice enacted in all those people who did evil, having the whole thing, having it all go through life and, having the story. It'd be better to have no story. That's still how the math all works out. And so
I don't think I don't think I've ever seen a mathematical equation that went along with Ecclesiastes. That's a first for me. Could you read out what that mathematical equation looks like? Because I'm not a mathematical nerd like you are. So tell us what that equation is.
It changes a few times. So first it's life less than death, less than unbirth, and then we had to change it to life is less than death plus life, which is also less than unbirth. And then now we have life is less than death squared plus life, which are all still less than unbirth. And so, I got to the end of the book and I closed it, and I'm like, well, I felt like I felt vindicated. Yeah, everything's vapor. Yeah, almost everything you do doesn't matter. Yeah, everyone's evil and wicked. Everyone gets judged and everyone gets punished as they're supposed to be. And yeah, life really isn't worth living because everyone is going to experience evil and suffering. Why are Christians okay? What? I just didn't understand it. How could any Christian call this infallible and true, and it be true, and yet it had that kind of ending message? I didn't understand. I didn't understand it, and I was a little discontent with my answer, but I did feel a bit vindicated. That I'm like, oh, so everything
Yeah.
I right. Okay. Clearly I'm missing something because St. Thomas Aquinas and C.S. Lewis and the Chuck Missler and all these other people who are way smarter than me and read it a lot more, they they obviously were pretty happy people. They had hope and stuff, and I don't have that. What am I missing? There's something I'm missing. I'm okay with if I understood it totally and then I reject it. It's like, okay, well, I understand it, but it's whatever. But what I felt like I was missing something. I'm like, this is like reading, the first half of a book and not hearing the second half. I don't get it. And I mean, and I guess in a sense I was, because it's all in the Old Testament still. And so it wasn't until I was reading through the Gospel of John, right, that that it hit me, because in Gospel of John chapter 3 he's talking to Nicodemus, and Nicodemus is in that secret conversation with Jesus, and Jesus hits him with one of the most famous verses, John 3:16. But before that, leading up to it, what brings to the most famous verse, John 3:16, was that conversation about about birth, and he tells him, verily, verily, amen, amen, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again. And I had heard that phrase plenty of times, but I hadn't heard that phrase since after I had read Ecclesiastes and vexated over this issue. So when I heard it
Yeah,
again, I'm like,
a whole different perspective, didn't it?
yeah, I'm like, wait, born again. Equation out again. We got a little equation. I'm like, okay, so I wrote the equation out again. I'm like, okay, this equation wasn't finished. It was life not worth living. It's at the bottom. It's less than death squared plus life, right? And then all of that's under unbirth. But what we have in the gospel, what we have with Jesus, is, all of that is going to be less than death squared plus life squared. It's this second birth, this second life that God is giving us. It was, and then that's when it clicked for me, because that second life is a perfect life. It's a life where we are finally sinless. We are in eternal communion with God and with other people without worry about whether or not they're lying to us or cheating us. We don't experience evil. We don't experience suffering for all eternity. But as for the experience part, as for all the judgment part, all of the horribleness, that the cross also covers all of that. The cross also, not only facilitated the second life and changed the equation of the life, but it also dealt with the difficult problem of all the suffering and evil that made life not worth living in the very first place. It was only because that Jesus died on the cross that facilitated the second life. It cured both of the ailments at once. Now we have a reason to live. Now it's worth living. But that's only true. That's only true in the Christian life, because only the Christian life offers an eternal salvation while totally satisfying justice and also granting complete amnesty and mercy.
Yeah, it's very interesting how God reaches out to all of us in different ways. He reached out to your nerdy mathematical life, but it makes a lot of sense because so many people identify with Ecclesiastes. If you took hope out of the equation, then life is not worth it. It just would not be worth it. And um, King
There,
Solomon
there's
really nailed it.
no pleasure that could be given that could make it worth it, because even though you may get to the next life and you have your good deeds outweighing your bad deeds, right? Like the Muslim might believe, or other faiths might believe that on your this karmic, it's a little different with some sort of, but it doesn't pay for the sins. That's what's important. I think that is what is qualitatively different with Christianity, is that it satisfies that justice clause, because and this is also what made this is also one of the bigger difficulties I had going into Christianity, is how is it that there could be complete perfect mercy and justice at the same time? The both of them seem totally antithetical to each other. How is this possible?
Right.
And it is only the cross that those two things meet, that we have complete suffering, wrath, and torment, mixing and being overcome by complete compassion, love, forgiveness, and mercy. The way I think of it is like it's like a shadow trying to exist on the surface of the sun. God added hell and suffering to his eternal experience when he died, because he's an eternal being with eternal experience, and he added that to his experience, and then it was completely consumed and overcome for all eternity to just be gone, because of who he is, because he is perfect and good, because there is no absence in him. It's like you can't there nothing, just it's like I said, a shadow on the face of the sun. It's immediately engulfed. There is no
Right. And I
and
think when you said King Solomon wrote it, he was probably one of the richest men that ever walked on this planet. And he was blessed in a lot of ways. And you could see through what he was writing there that at some point in his life, because he had everything, life was worthless. But it also made me think about different people like movie stars. And let's take Elvis Presley, for example. He died at, I don't know, 40 years old or something like that. And here he was, the king of rock and roll, and he had everything, all these hits, and rich beyond comparison. But he died a very sad, lonely death. He was very lonely, and he had given up. He had lost all hope on everything. And here was a man that actually started singing gospel way back when. And then he had this rich life, and he performed and he did all this stuff, but life became worthless to him, empty. And I just think about him. A lot of people worship him, but if you really knew how he died and became addicted to drugs, because everything was just King Solomon and Ecclesiastes would have been a big deal to him. Somebody would have turned him on and said, "Here, read this. Read the book of Ecclesiastes and tell me if this doesn't remind you of yourself. What do you need to do to get yourself up and out of this hole?" You know.
Yeah.
So
And the answer to that is there is nothing you can do. There's nothing, not a single thing any of us can do. We are totally helpless. We are just totally broken. We need someone else to do something for us, because doing it our way, trying to help ourselves. We see all these self-help gurus and books and all this stuff that we see nowadays. But it's doing things ourselves, trying to fix ourselves, is exactly what got us here in the first place. I think of those videos of like the toddlers, where they make a mess and then they start trying to clean it and it just makes the mess bigger. and or they like put the napkin down and then they just start spreading it out bigger and making it much worse. I mean, that's us trying to help ourselves. We can't. There's nothing we can do. We are we're totally screwed. And and that's what
I had made such a mess out of my life. And here I thought I was a smart person and I was creative with all my photography and all the other creative stuff. And I look back on it and I think, geez, what a waste of time. What a waste. And
Yeah,
I
and
almost at
it's all about,
sometimes think of it was a wasted life, you know,
yeah.
but it's not. When I start thinking about my offspring and my sons and my grandson and my
Mhm.
great grandson, I realize that it's not a waste. I sent out something today, and I think it's a short thing, but I think it goes along with what we're talking about here, because I know it was very powerful in my life. It says, when you know God, you begin to understand yourself because you are made in the image of God. And I think that's very true. You were talking about all the self help books and stuff like that. You can't find yourself. You can't do that unless you know God to begin with. You're never going to really understand yourself because the whole Christian worldview, it comes into focus at that point, and it tells you this is because I when I was an atheist till I was 30 years old, I thought I was arrogant and I thought I knew everything, and then when I became a Christian, I realized how stupid I was, and I still am, you know. But now that I am trying to really understand God, and that's by getting into the Bible and reading about what He has to say. But I also try to look at the universe and go out there and look at all the stars, and I understand God a little better, but I understand myself a lot better too in the
Yeah.
process of that.
Yeah, it's like you learn who you were supposed to be. Like you weren't even you before. And I think that's one thing that really attracted me to Christianity is because remember the backdrop of my entire journey leading up to this and reading Ecclesiastes and the rest was I want to make sure there's nothing waiting for me on the other side. I want to make sure that judgment Solomon's talking about. No, thank you. You keep that part to yourself, and so. Um,
Yeah,
uh,
I think I remember picking you up and taking you over to Bassa Donuts
yeah,
in the evening. And I remember how depressed you were.
yeah,
Uh, and here I was trying to buy you sweets and make you happy, but it was mostly just to hang out with you and to listen to what was on your heart.
mhm,
And I think as Christians, that's what we have to listen more instead of always talk.
yeah.
But I knew, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. I'll let you finish because there's something I wanted to say.
I I just knew that you had to get this out off of your heart. You and I had done a lot of talking at that point, but I knew there was just some things were just not clicking yet, and I knew I felt like they would at some point in time. But God brought other people into your life, like Aunt Ellen and Grandma, and they kind of sat and listened to different people and talk back and forth about logical things. And I think God reaches out to us many times in our emotions, but He also reaches out, especially men, in the logical world. How does this stack up to everything else that I have learned or read about? And then it's like, oh Jesus, I need help here. I need a way out of this morass.
Mhm.
So go ahead. What were you going to say, Justin?
I was just gonna say, that's as my backdrop being, trying to justify my own suicide, if you want to phrase it that way. Um, the one of the things that the biggest thing, honestly, that attracted me to Christianity was that death, that not being me anymore. I hated who I was. I hated everything about myself. I hated what I had become. I hate where I was going. I didn't see any other. I hated how the world was. I hated just everything. I was so bitter, and Christianity offered two things. It offered one. Second Life, I'm like, okay, well, that just sounds too good to be true. I don't care about that. But what I found even more appealing was it offered a death, an actual literal death. Jesus says, if you want to gain your life, you have to lose it. And I'm like, oh well, done. If this is true, then that doesn't seem very hard. you know.
Did you feel like death would free you from this body
No, it wasn't
and this
about.
planet?
I'm not sure it was really about freedom. It was more just about like like um like lack, absence. I'm not sure I would put it as freedom. It was more like a cessation. I guess you could put it like freedom in the same way that someone might seek freedom from pain, but I'm not sure it was exactly a freedom that I wanted, because I knew that at the end of the day I could. I live in America. I could always just uproot myself and run off and go see things, but I didn't really care about that. I didn't really care about going and seeing things and have expressing my will. That wasn't really important to me at all. It was the why it was the telos. I wanted to know why to do any of it. What was my motivation? If I had no reason to go out and see the world except for its own sake, I didn't think the world or life was worth living intrinsically by its own sake. And that's why this verse is so important, is because it affirms, like, yeah, it's for its own sake, it's not worth it at all. People think that they'll go and get their fulfillment by going and seeing the world and exploring and meeting people, and they just won't. They'll get to the end of it, they'll see everything, they'll do everything just like Solomon, and they'll be left empty and miserable. And that's why some of the most miserable people in the world are filthy, filthy rich. And I knew that. And so I wanted to know, why should I care about any of this? Why do I want to do any of it? Why do I want to get rich? Why do I want money? Why do I want to see anything? None of it mattered if I didn't have a telos. I needed a telos. I needed some indestructible reason to live. And it had to be indestructible. Had to be indestructible, because if you could break it, then it would just go the way any other thing. You'd have it and then it'd be gone, and then it's all vapor. And so I'm like, oh wow, this book is saying, well, everything's vapor. Okay, well, I'm on board with that. Life isn't worth living. Okay, well, I'm on board with that. Like, everyone sucks. Oh, I'm on board with that. And that's oh, I need to lose my life in order to gain it. Well, that seems pretty. That seems pretty
What does
easy.
that mean? In the beginning, it was like, what is that?
I need to be born again. Wait a second. That changes the math a little bit. And so,
Yeah, how do I get back in my mother's womb?
yeah, yeah, exactly. Nicodemus, sarcasm. But you can
Yeah.
sort of see the natural progression of my thought, going from the super bitter, harsh, like almost anti-theistic mindset, to like a softening of like, wait a second, like there seems to be something to this. I'm starting to get what I was missing. And what I was missing was that marriage of suffering and compassion and wrath, that only happened on the cross. And that's why it's so impactful when Jesus only, in the same conversation, tells him, right before John 3:16, tells him, just as Moses lifted the serpent up in the desert. That serpent that the Jews were getting bitten by snakes, and the only way they get healed is to look at that weird brazen serpent in the desert. This very peculiar thing that happens that's never explained until Jesus comes by, and he tells them, just as that happened, the Son of Man will be lifted up high. And then John continues on later to say, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Mm-hmm. Whoever believes in him may have eternal life. And that's where it's all about. That's the only thing that makes it all worth it, is because that satisfaction of the experience of evil, both inflicted, personally inflicted upon us. That righting of all wrongs. That's all there is, and that's only possible because Jesus Christ died for our sins, because God sent his one and only Son, his uniquely begotten Son, down that we may benefit. And in the same way that, we eat meat and an innocent creature dies so that way we can continue, we do that when we eat the bread because an innocent man had to die so that way we can continue. But he overcame it. And
Yep.
now we get to spend our life in eternal communion with him, and that's just so cool. Now instead of resenting all the things that I could do, now I'm just making a checklist all the time about like, oh, piano, I'll learn piano in the next life, oh, harp, oh, I got plenty of time to learn harp, and I want to learn how to do like electrical soldering. I probably have to learn that just because it's practical. But I want to learn how to do everything now. I want to experience all the different things. I want to see a waterfall. I want to build a waterfall from scratch. I want to build giant gardens. I want to make humongous paintings. I want to be, I want to carve things on a moon, and like I want to just go all out. But
Hey,
I care about it until Christ saved me.
Since we only have 5 minutes left here, or less than 5 minutes, I want to tell everybody my grandson Justin here is going to be a father very shortly, by the end of this month. And I actually, probably by the time we meet again in September, he will have a baby boy. Tell us a little bit about that, and maybe we could talk about that on the next podcast. What it's like to go through and being a daddy and having a baby be born, your first one. And I'm going to be a great grandfather, a great great grandfather, something like that. I'm not sure.
You'll be great.
So talk about that for a couple minutes, real quick.
Yeah, so we're doing about 2 weeks. It is definitely scary, especially in light of all these verses, because I know the only way his life will be worth it is if he goes through the same process of dying to himself and realizing that life is just not worth it unless he's got Jesus, unless he's got Yeshua, HaMashiach, the one and the only, that he understands these things. And so it's the weight of spiritually leading my coming son is not lost on me, because I know how difficult I was and how many questions I had and how cynical and skeptical I was on all of them. And so I guess in a sense, the reason I want to learn all this stuff is so that way I can make sure that any people I interact with or, children that I raise up are going to have answers to the questions that I had to go digging for.
And what is your son's name going to be?
My son's name is going to be Eliezer, Eliezer. There's 11 people in the Bible named Eliezer, 13 if you include both instances of Lazarus, which is the transliteration or the Hellenized version, really, of Eliezer. That's what Lazarus is. It's Hellenized into Lazarus. And then the most prominent people named Eliezer were the servant, Abraham's servant that was going to inherit Abraham's estate before he had his heirs, and Moses' second son, who I believe he was the next high priest after Aaron, if I remember correctly. I know he was at least one of the higher priests, but I think he was the second high priest.
Very interesting. So it's going to be interesting to get your perspective. Being born again is one thing, but being born is another. And I know that you and your wife, Alejandra, are going to make wonderful parents. That you just will. And he's going to have a great father that will get on the way of Christian apologetics. And it will be fun to hear what he has to say when he gets to that age, like it was for me with you. And who knew that we were going to be doing podcasts about Christianity and the Bible? But here we are. Here we are.
And so we got 5 seconds left. Is there anything else we need to say?
Yeah, I got to finish up right here. And I didn't do this in the very beginning, but I'm going to say thank you for coming to Christ Talk Special. Thank you for joining us on this episode. Um, Today, we had Justin here with us today, but I want to give special thanks to Wingate TV, Transform U Media, Zach with PAC Channel, and Jay Stoyan with the Disability Channel for hosting our shows. We will see you in September when Justin will be a father. So, Justin, I'll see you next month.
See you soon.